Hello, everyone. Thank you for
Hello.
joining us
Hello.
at Wigtown Wednesday. I would say here at the Wigtown Book Festival, but it's in fact here at every single one of our individual homes across the universe, assembled electronically for your pleasure. I'm Lee Randall, and I'm joined tonight by two of Britain's most erudite and funniest men, the Reverend Richard Coles and Robin Ince. You'll know Richard as a former communard and current Church of England priest, and as the presenter of BBC Radio 4's Saturday Live. Robin Ince also wears many hats. He's a comic, an author, a broadcaster, and a popularizer of scientific ideas. And I paid a visit to his website, which reminded me that The Guardian called him a becardiganed polymath, but in honor of the temperatures, he's only wearing a t-shirt today. Nevertheless, his polymath status stands. Now, before we get tucked in, some housekeeping. Questions and comments go in the chat box because you're all muted so that we can chat among ourselves. That's also where you'll find a link to the festival's donate button. If you can spare any pennies or pounds or hundreds of pounds to help the festival, that would be grand. You'll also find links to the festival bookshop, and that's where you can buy Richard and Robin's books and show them your support individually. Then at 9 o'clock tonight, those of you who have rented or who own a copy of the movie we're about to talk about can stay here and join a watch party and share all your thoughts and ideas about The Wicker Man. So, the cult film classic that's been called the Citizen Kane of horror. Came out in 1973 with a script by Anthony Schaefer, and it was directed by Robin Hardy. The cast features Christopher Lee in what he called his best performance, Britt Ekland, or shall I say the husk of Britt Ekland, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, Ingrid Pitt and Edward Woodward, among others. Now, one synopsis I read of the story said, a pious, joyless policeman pits himself against a community of morally incontinent islanders in the belief that a teenage girl has gone missing from her home. When it came out, one of the executives from the company that made it called this the worst film he'd ever seen. But more recently, it's had a real resurgence in status. And one film historian said it has stood the test of time because it's about ideas. It engages you at an intellectual level. It's about paganism, the clash between superstition and modernity, authority and sexuality. Now, for our audience, what's especially notable and resonant is the fact that the exquisite locations are mostly Dumfries and Galloway, with a quick tour of David Hemming's garden, it turns out. And I know that there'll be people in our audience who remember those 7 weeks of filming really well. And I want you to feel free to pop your anecdotes into the chat box because everyone can read them and share that. So anyway, it's enough for me. You're not here to listen to me. Welcome, Richard and Robin. Thank you for being here tonight. I'd like to start out with the most basic question of all and ask each of you to talk about your personal relationship with the film. When did you first see it? Did it grab you right away, or was it a slow burn, et cetera, et cetera? Let's start with you, Richard. What about you and The Wicker Man?
Oh, well, as soon as I had a very gothic imagination when I was young, going into my teens. And I think I was 11 when The Wicker Man came out. And I think I kind of caught wind of it. I don't know how. It was talked about sort of hushed tones, like a sort of arcane ritual. It wasn't just a film you watched in, it was a kind of thing you became part of. And I was always wanting to see it. And of course, I wasn't allowed to. I finally got to see it at Warwick Arts Centre. When I was about 16, 1978, they did a season of the horror films that you really wanted to see but couldn't find. Anyway, Suspiria was another one. But The Wicker Man, I mean, it's interesting because I watched it again yesterday, and I've watched it several times. But perhaps because I was particularly receptive as a teenager, or perhaps it's the peculiar magic of the film, I remember lines of dialogue, and I remember so vividly some of the scenes from it. I mean, it's sort of had a haunting persistence in my life ever since. And of course, the things you love in teenagehood, maybe you fall out of love with in age, but actually, I like it even more. Yesterday, I was talking about it, and somebody who'd never seen it said, "How would you describe it?" And I said, satanic godspell transplanted to Gauguin's Brittany.
That's perfect. I wanna come back to that and about whether or not this really is a horror film. But Robin, can we hear about your first interactions with
Oh,
the
you see, you must never call it a horror film because Christopher Lee, I've not been in any horror films. I've been in terrifying films, never horror films. Yeah, he always had this kind of very quite, sort of snotty and rather pompous attitude. I think out of the horror movie actors, Cushing and Price and Lee was the one who was kind of had a certain pomposity. And there was, in fact, I met Robin Hardy a few years ago. I was doing an event to launch a horror book, and I was chatting to him, and he told me the thing about Christopher Lee and his wonderful kind of there's an old line about Christopher Lee, which was a lot of actors would go, oh bloody hell, we're working with Christopher Lee. And I said, the thing about Christopher Lee, either he's flown it or his mother was one. And that, there's a lovely, but I'm sorry, I'm not answering the question. I'll get to that a story involving Charles Gray later on. But my first experience of Wicker Man was actually when I was 8 years old. I bought this book. I've still got the cover somewhere. I don't know where I put it, but it's Horror Movies by Alan Frank. And it was also the book that Mark Gatiss and all the League of Gentlemen. It was the kind of the Bible for the 8-year-old who was a bit of an outsider, a bit of the weird kid. So my first experience was this. Hopefully you can see this wonderful double-page spread. If you can just see that there on that side, hopefully Peter Cushing looking through a magnifying glass in creepy. On this side, there we are. It was Edward Woodward with A Hand of Fate. And of course, like many horror movie books, the thing is when you see them, what you don't realise is the pictures are not pictures from the film. They're promo pictures. They're pictures that were taken on set. So my imagined version of the Wicker Man was very, very different to what I first saw. I didn't see it till I was probably 15, 16 years old. I am, though I don't look it, I am younger than Richard. I was only 3 when the film came out. And but I instead I was taken to see The Bellstone Fox. That's the first film I saw as a child. At 3 years old, my dad took me to the cinema to see a film in which a man dies of a heart attack in the end. And as a 3-year-old, I said, Dad, what happened then? He goes, oh, he dies. That's what happens to some people. So that's part of my horror education. But I think it was on Moviedrome. Alex Cox introduced, and I'd been waiting to see it for years. I'd read about it in Danny Peary's Cult Movies book as well. And I don't think it disappointed. I mean, I think it's I don't know what I imagined. I wish I could remember what I thought it was going to be. But I certainly didn't have a sense of disappointment. It had so much going on in it. And that would have been the version that I think is about 83 minutes long, the severely cut version.
Okay, the first time I ever saw it was yesterday.
Oh, was it?
What did you think, Lee?
I'm 60 years old. I'd seen bits and pieces of it, but that was my first full viewing of. Well, it was much prettier aesthetically. It was much more beautiful than I imagined it would be. That was my main takeaway. I'm sorry. It's
Oh, it's fine.
But it is very beautiful. Yeah.
And also, can I just say my personal thing? Christopher Lee in a Cher wig. I'm so there for that.
See, that's what I wanted to know. Whenever I see, because one of the things that I love about seeing footage of Edward Woodward and Christopher Lee is seeing two men at the real top of toupees. Lee had a fantastic toupee. He never. The only time I think you can ever see Lee in a film where he doesn't have his toupee on is when he was in Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, and apparently he walked in for the audition, Billy Wilder, and Billy Wilder just didn't take to him, and his agent said, just go in without the piece on. And it's the only, and of course, Christopher Lee, well, of course, for Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, I had to shave my head. But both him and Woodward had excellent toupees, and I'm a great fan. And then I'm always fascinated by, did Christopher Lee wear the wig on top of a toupee, as Charlton Heston did when he did Man for All Seasons in the West End? It was where the poor wig person on the first day made that terrible mistake of going, Charlton, will you be taking up what? Nothing, Charlton. I was just saying what a lovely head of hair you have. I'll pop it on top of that lovely head of hair that is definitely yours. But you've got the receipt for it.
Brilliant. So is this a first-rate film, or is this one of the world's great B movies?
I think it's both good and bad simultaneously, if you can have such a thing. I mean, there are moments in it which I think are just ravishingly beautiful and extraordinarily powerful and haunting and distinctive. And then all of a sudden it just crashes into something of banality. But there's something about that contributes to it, to making it work. you get the sense it was kind of made on the hoof pretty much. There's something very rushed about it and sketchy about it too. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why the film is so memorable. It kind of crashes around a bit, lumbers around a bit. And sometimes what you see is at odds with what you hear. The music, which is one of the most memorable and pungent things about it, is sometimes doing something very different from what you're seeing. It feels slightly thrown together, which I like.
Can you tell me some of your favorite, when you say there are moments that are beautiful and poetic and resonant, what are those moments for you? What are some examples?
I think the opening sequence of Edward Woodward in his police plane flying over what I think is in fact South Africa, musically. The way the film begins with this sense that there's this policeman in a seaplane arriving at some island, I think that's just very powerful. And the music, I think, there's something that's both familiar and strange about it, and that's so often the case with what makes a film that's deeply makes you feel anxious, is that it is at the same time both familiar and strange. And it sets that up beautifully. The final scene, of course, would be remembered by anyone who's ever seen it. But I think the first thing I think of when I think of the film is actually the Hobbyhorse scene, where Edward Woodward is kind of walking around, I think it's Kakubri, I'm not sure, but he's looking up the ginnels and the alleys, and he sees the horse at the other side. There's this sort of strange chase thing that happens, which is, again, familiar and frightening.
What about you, Robin? Good movie, good B movie, bad movie?
It is interesting, as Rich was saying, that it's such a contrast. I mean, I think one thing is, I know there's much debating about this. I actually think the 83-minute version is a good film. I think a lot of the added scenes, in fact, I think the fact that in the 83-minute version, you have it starting with the arrival of the seaplane, is much better than the not very well acted scenes, which are on the mainland, where you have, and I'm going to forget his name now, and he was in the Malin Streak, and he was also in Flash Gordon, but the guy who plays the kind of, the postman and the policeman who are kind of, making fun of Edward Woodward. I think it starts much better in that version, but I think those little scenes, like, for instance, the placing of the frog in the mouth,
Oh, yeah.
The moment of the breastfeeding in the deconsecrated church, in the remnants of the church, and even that when the full story of the fact that they were making it on the cusp of winter, and so when you see all those pregnant women walking through it, it's people desperately moving trees with painted on blossom. I think those things, that otherworldly, those uncanny moments are, and that's where I think still, and I also think Edward Woodward it's a very interesting performance. It's for us, it's a different experience because, for those who've only seen him as Callan, tough guy Callan, which is a very good, very gritty series, seeing him in this kind of part, and he also does something which is quite unusual. Normally the lead character in a film, even if they're a bad guy, you end up empathizing. So say Michael Caine in Get Carter, in the end, when I apologize, by the way, it's going to be a spoiler alert, he gets killed at the end of Get Carter. And I can say that the remake of Get Carter with Sylvester Stallone is as good as the remake of Wicker Man with Nicolas Cage. Please never, ever see that film. It's so appalling. But it's Edward Woodward, you never ultimately empathize, or I don't feel you ever empathize with him.
I didn't.
No, you feel there's a level of sadness and tragedy, but his pomposity, his kind of, his starchy churchiness, unlike nearly any other film. I was thinking of The Player with Tim Robbins. I think of King of New York with Christopher Walken. Bad guys, you still empathise because they're the lead character. Edward Woodward, you kind of go, well, Edward, I mean, come on, you had your opportunity. She was banging on the wall. It's all it took. That's literally all it took. Banging on the wall, let her in. This would never have happened to you. And now you're being urinated on by a goat.
I take a different view, actually. I find him a figure of pathos. I never did until I watched it again, as I said yesterday, and I found myself quite moved by him, particularly in the last scene. But then obviously I'm in the business of people dying extravagantly out of faithfulness to Christ. So there's a kind of precedent for me with that. I think I found him rather, I almost kind of willed him onto the pyre in the past. There's something, isn't there, about flinty Calvinism that is unattractive. Although, of course, actually it's much more complex than that. And I admire his outrage, the fact that this child has gone missing. I admire his sort of dedication to uncovering the truth of what's happened. I think the pathos perhaps really hinges on that moment of realization at the end, when he thinks he's been steering events, but actually finds out that he is the victim of a bigger play that he didn't see.
Well, I think that is very interesting. I mean, in terms of thinking of, and I apologize, by the way, it was John Hallam, I think, is the actor I was thinking of in the early bit. But it was, it makes me think of films like Hereditary and Midsummer by the same director, both of which may wear some. That I always think is a brilliant moment. That point where you ultimately realise that someone who believed they were in charge, that loss of control is something that will hit you so hard in the stomach. That horror.
But as a viewer, I never felt that Woodward's character was in control. I don't know if that's because I already knew how the movie ended, or if it's because I wasn't convinced he was in control. I always Islanders.
I think it's because, sorry, I think it's because he thinks he's in control. I am Sergeant Bowie of the West Highland Constabulary, and he rat-a-tat-tats on the bar to shut everybody up in the pub, and he interrupts a class. I mean, he is what we would now call entitled, and it's the moment of revelation when he realizes that the writ by which he runs does not run here, not even remotely. I think that's quite touching. There's pathos in it for me.
It's weird because I had a moment this morning where, when you realise how, I on an hourly basis realise how startlingly stupid I am, but I'd suddenly thinking about the fact that it was on a double bill with Don't Look Now, another, that is an utter masterpiece, I think. And I'd always thought that was a kind of incongruous mix. And I don't know why, I suppose because one would very much be considered to be art house. And then I suddenly realised both films are about the search for a child. Both films are about the ultimate illusion so exactly that thing where Donald Sutherland, that moment of revelation at the end of Don't Look Now, one of the most in fact both those films I would say in terms of the 1970s for incredible, almost sickening revelations of narrative. They're both, but I'd never, for some reason I'd never realized, and I don't even know if British Lion, when they stuck them together, I don't think anyone had a meeting and when actually it turns out these have an interesting mirroring of narrative. But I thought that is an interest, and then I thought the difference between Edward Woodward's desire to find Rowan Morrison is because that is what must be done. It is what the book says, it's what the police manual says, and it's what the Bible says. And it doesn't feel that it's ultimately down to what I would say was an internal morality or ethics. Do you see what I mean? It's like, this is what the book says. Whereas with Donald Sutherland, of course, it is that search for the loss of love and the loss of... and I think that the two, when you look at their two narratives together, and also the fact that both films are dealing with a world that, is it uncanny? Is it really, at the end of the Wicker Man, is there any such thing as witchcraft? Is there any strangers beyond human-based witchcraft? Whereas, of course, in Don't Look Now, you do have just those little moments like when he foresees his own funeral, or the strange moments with those two elderly ladies. And I think both du Maurier and Schaffer, the way they played with a certain kind of the nature of uncanniness, the nature of being in a foreign territory which should nevertheless still feel like your own, that alienation, I think it surprises me how much, in fact, there is in common with those films.
I mean, they were yoked together, as I understand it, Robin, because the studio hated the film and just wanted to bury it. So they stuck it on as a B feature, didn't they, with Don't Look Now, which, of course, was an enormous success. And The Wicker Man, it took a while to make its money back. I mean, a long time, I think, before it did, wasn't it?
It's interesting, though, because of course, Christopher Lee talks about the fact I rang up my people I knew who were film critics, and I said, I will pay for your seat, go and see The Wicker Man. And none of them asked for their money, and which is lucky, because he was apparently quite tight as well. By the way, I've just told you, because it's such a lovely story involving... the people when they used to share a caravan and I've now gone and forgot his bloody name because it's so hot in my attic. Charles Gray, when he made The Devil Rides Out and they had to share a caravan together, and it was midwinter, and he went, oh God, sharing a caravan with Christopher Lee, one doesn't know what to do, stand outside and freeze to death or go back in and be bored to death. Anyway, but In fact, Robin Hardy. What he told me was he said he found it fascinating when they were making Wicker Man. Sometimes big fans of horror movies, Dracula fans, come and go, "Hello, I wonder, is there any chance that I could go and meet Christopher Lee?" And he'd go, "He's in that caravan there," and he'd go, "But on your head bid," he goes, "No, I'm a big fan of Christopher Lee." And then he'd see these people kind of stumbling out 5 hours later, still only up to 1948 of Christopher Lee's career. And another thing that I did that was rather wonderful. No, anyway, that had nothing to do with what I was saying. It doesn't matter.
Listen,
never less than tangential.
One of the other things I read about this film was that it was a piece of moral philosophy and a plea for tolerance, and that it's about the stark differences between two belief systems. And some people think that both belief systems get equal time in the film, and some people say, well, actually, they don't. So I'd like to get both of you to weigh in on how valid that is.
I'm not sure it's a film which makes a convincing plea for tolerance, really. I suppose I can imagine a time when that would have been something that people would say about it. But if anything, I think it's about intolerance, isn't it? It's about two cultures completely not understanding each other, actually. And you get this incredible crash. You have Sergeant Howie with absolutely firm as granite in his convictions, comes across a world and a system of belief that he simply doesn't recognise. Whereas for the islanders, what they're looking for is something to make their crops grow again. So, I mean, in that sense, it's a dialogue of the deaf, isn't it? What does Howie do when he encounters? Is it Howie or Derry? I can't remember. When he encounters them at their shenanigans. I mean, he's just outraged by it. He has kind of one register, doesn't he, which is outrage. He confronts the schoolmistress over her failure to introduce any of the children to Christ. I think one of the most powerful things in the film is the kind of guilelessness with which the Summer Islanders participate in hoodwinking the cop, and also when challenged and when questioned, happily volunteer that they do think that people don't die but are transformed into hares and scamper around the fields in the spring. And they're complete, and I think that's cleverly done, isn't it? Because you don't get the sense that this is a sinister conspiratorial coven. It's just a community of people who march to a very different beat. And that's one of the reasons I think why the horror, if that's the right word, it works. It's because they are innocent of the terrible death, in a way, or innocent of the knowledge of the terrible death they're going to inflict on this chap who doesn't know what's coming.
I think that's when you mentioned before flinty Calvinism, I think that's the interesting thing. And the time that it came out, not long after these kind of, the ideals, and generally they were ideals and not realities of free love. And as you said, every time that he sees flesh, every time he sees desire, every time he sees, and it gives you that form of Christianity, that form of quite fundamentalist religion, which says that any desire, any of our animal needs or wants is ultimately something that is disgusting and must be quashed. And I think that's why, as you said also, they're not evil, the islanders, they're doing what must be done. And I think that's one of the intriguing things. And again, I would say this is interesting in Midsummer as well, which is have you seen Midsummer, by the way?
I have, yes. I watched it thinking it would be a film about Midsummer. I didn't realise it was a horror film until I won't want to spoil it for anybody, but there's a moment when you are left in absolutely no doubt this is not going to end happily with folk dancing. Yes, I have. Sorry, I saw it on a plane. I think can't have been on a plane. Maybe it was.
Yeah, it could have. No,
you remember the plane?
But yeah, one seater off to an island of your choice. But it is. I do think that Midsummer at the end of it, there is still a moment where you go, well, this is an alternative way of existing. Yeah. And is this ultimately a damnable way of it? And I think that's what's so interesting about the meeting of the old gods in this, which seems to ultimately, apart from obviously the fact that they have to kill someone for the crops, the ultimate underneath it all, their life is a much better. There is an existence that is so much more in tune with the reality of nature and the possibilities of nature. So
but also the failures of nature, because the reason he's there is because their crops have failed, haven't they?
Yeah.
So the other thing I'd just say about Calvinism, I mean, Calvinism in its Scottish form is not readily associated with a kind of warm enthusiasm for the pleasures of matter, of created matter. But Calvin himself, and actually a lot of Calvinism, was curious about nature. Calvinism wrote about the book of nature as being a source of revelation, just as the book of scripture is. And a lot of his ideas fed into the rise of the Enlightenment and the scientific project of looking, well, this is your territory, not mine, Robin. So I think it's slightly incomplete to imagine that Calvin is a kind of, or Calvinism is a polar opposite to an interest and sympathy for the natural world. It just has an agenda, and the agenda is that it is, as the psalmist would have it, it has to display the wonders of God, if you see what I mean.
But I think that's when you say flinty Calvinism, I think that's the thing. It's not really Calvinism. It's that that sharp dryness of
and that kind of draw you'd associate with Knox on his least sunny days. And Knox on a sunny day was not very sunny.
Knox on a Sunny Day is still one of my favourite Proclaimers songs, and it was only a B-side, and it really shouldn't have been. But I think it's. I was chatting with a friend of mine, Hugh Warwick, who's a hedgehog expert, and we were talking about, because it's interesting when you bring up science as well, all of these different ways that sometimes can be seen as clashes with the natural world, whether it's a fundamental religious, whether it's sometimes when scientism becomes detached from the other. And my friend Hugh gave me this wonderful quote from a guy called Andrew Lack, who I think was an ornithologist, leading ornithologist and scientist. And he was a Christian as well. And he said, scientists do themselves a disservice when they deny the existence of the unquantifiable. And I thought there was something very beautiful, because that seemed to me, when he said that to me this afternoon, I thought that also links into what we're talking about. There are, the best horror films or imaginative fiction films, whatever of this kind, the best folk horror films are dealing with a certain sensibility in humanity, which is unquantifiable, which is a relationship sometimes to the grass or the flowers or whatever it might be, which, yes, we might be able to understand them from the perspective of science, but there is still a reaction when we see the roses behind you, whatever it might be, there is a reaction which is not quantifiable. Yeah,
I think it's right. And also, related to that is, I think the other thing that the sergeant represents is order. That's a very powerful tension in the film, isn't there? He comes, a single person in a place he's never been before, but so convinced of the rightness of what he represents and so convinced of his authority to do so that it doesn't occur for him for a second that he might have to fight his corner, if you see what I mean. And it's a completely different scheme of, the dynamics are completely different on Summerisle, aren't they? When they're much more tied in, not to a kind of project which is about being preeminent over nature, having dominion over nature, but very much of being conscious of being part of it, and the kind of cycle of birth and death and regeneration, which is not something that Christianity, particularly in its kind of Northern Protestant forms, has been. That's very distant, I think. Those two things are very much in tension.
It's also very colonial. What he does is it has that sense of, we have come with our Bible, we want these things from you. No level of understanding. When you see us, around the world, some of the terrible crimes, some of the terrible things that we've committed by never managing to, or never even attempting to understand, quite often, indigenous people. I think about, there's a fascinating book called Dark Emu, which is about so much of the kind of the hidden or lost history of the indigenous people of Australia. Yeah. And you just go, and it's so much more complex than any of the illusions that we like to imagine. And watching it again the other night, I thought, that's another thing it has in it as well. It's kind of about colonial. It's about, I have the truth. This is the truth. Whatever you may say, there is no truth in it because I have the truth.
It's slightly complex, that, isn't it? But I think you're absolutely right, I think. And he does have, not for a second does he doubt that he represents something to which they should all cleave, the authority of which is unquestioned. But the interesting one is Lord Summerisle, isn't he? Because Lord Summerisle clearly is kind of recognisable not just as an islander, but as someone who has a life beyond the island, is part of the structures of authority. He's the JP. Do you remember he has to go to him to ask for permission to exhume the body of Rowan Morrison? So Lord Summerisle is a particularly complex figure, isn't he? That on the one hand, he kind of sits comfortably in a recognisable world. The sergeant addresses him as my lord, for example, aware of their kind of relative places in the social structure. But he is also, of course, revealed very soon as the worst drag queen in the history of British film. And doing a dance, which I would well. If I'd done that on Strictly, I'd probably got to round 3.
It's a wonderful thing, that look, isn't it? He wrote to Cine Fantastique when there was they did a special Wicker Man issue, and apparently the critic was rather shoddy towards Christopher Lee. And at one point he said, and then Christopher Lee looked preposterous. You know, try not looking preposterous when you're wearing a smock and trainer sneakers and a great big wig. I think he looks rather wonderful. And then again, was that a wig on a wig on a wig? Did he wear the wig and then on top of the wig have his wig for summer on, and then the wig of the wig? These are big questions that Mark Kermode has not got round to yet.
There used to be a drag queen. There was a drag pub called the Elephant and Castle in South London in the 1980s. And there was a drag queen called Bermondsey Bertha, who actually was a docker from Bermondsey, didn't come from a very strongly working class London background. But on a Friday night, he used to do Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart, but dressed as Christopher Lee in The Wicker Man. And that was, I have to say, if you ever saw that, it was an extraordinary. I can think about it. It's so vivid in my memory now. Anyway, that's an aside. Sorry.
It's a wonderful aside, though.
It is. It is. There's so many. This movie takes us to so many great bits of trivia. Another thing I read was that both Hardy and Schaefer said that rather than being a cautionary tale about paganism, they were writing a movie about the dangers of fascism and mass cults and religious fundamentalism. What do either of you or both of you think about that? Does it make a convincing argument against all those evils?
I think probably those kind of arguments tell you more about the people who are doing the arguing than the film. I mean, the film, I think the version we would take away of it now, if you were to show that to a kind of audience of under 30s, I think they'd probably have a very different take on it from how I would have had when I was a teenager. I don't know. It's an interesting one, isn't it? It's about where the film invites our sympathies. Are we invited to sympathise with a sort of the prelapsarian innocence of the community of Summer Isle until we know a little bit more? I mean, there are always hints, aren't there? The strange sweeties in the sweet shop, and that you always get the sense that sort of some bloody end is not very far away. It's haunted by the sinister, I think, throughout. So that. One of my favourite scenes in it is the maypole dance, which must surely be the creepiest maypole dance in the history of popular cultural forms, don't you think? There's a bit where what on earth did the parents of the kids in, I don't know which one, perhaps there are some with us to be interested to find out, what on earth did they make of it? Because I think the premiere was at the Regal in Stranraer, as I recall. I remember I spoke to someone when I was last in Whithorn, who was one of the stag men in the procession, and he told me that they'd all gone to, was it the Regal in Stranraer? Somebody I'm sure will know. And when they came out, one of the mothers of one of the children in it said, well, if I'd known that's what it was going to be, I would never have let them in it. That extraordinary scene where they dance around the maypole doing a strange sort of warlock dance, and the chap sings the song about the feather and the bird.
See, that's properly uncanny, isn't it? That bit where I love that the conversations that apparently were had while it was being made, and someone from British Lions saying, so we're making this horror film, and so on. Oh no, Robin Hardy said it's not a horror film. He said it's a musical. What? And when you especially think that a film like Lost Horizon, the disastrous musical version of Lost Horizon with Peter Finch and Liv Ullmann, which actually does have similar choreography in it as well.
I saw it.
It's a really terrible film. It's still on Talking Pictures quite often, I think, now. Bloody
awful.
They
called it Lost Investment, didn't they?
Yeah. I find those kind of moments, which are, it's a fascinating. Every time you think when you first see it that you've got a handle on what the film is, I think within the first half hour there will be and also I think one of the things that's important about it, by the way, in answer to your question about what Schaefer and Hardy, I don't think it's that. It's so interesting because Hardy in particular, I think, quite often rewrote what he said, and their strange and strange relationship later on. But I think if it's in any way meant to be a warning against fascism or totalitarianism, it fails dismally on that. I personally, I've never thought of it like that. But yes, that bit where. Oh, sorry.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you, Robin.
No, it's fine.
I was thinking the tension which really struck me about it is the difference between mainland and island, actually. And interesting, of course, none of it was actually filmed on an island. I think they filmed a bit flying over Skye, I think, didn't they? But there is something about the way islanders, as kind of defined communities by the nature of being an island, encounter someone who comes from a mainland. I think that's a very interesting tension. And it occurred to me, again, watching it yesterday, one thing I hadn't realised before is that it takes a week to get there. So we're not talking about Mull. We're talking really about somewhere like St Kilda. I mean, even more than that. It's very distant, isn't it? It's not somewhere that's readily accessible, even though you kind of recognise the architecture and the language. So there is something about its remote. I don't know if you've ever been to St Kilda. I went a couple of years ago and had this most extraordinary place, this lump of rock out in the North Atlantic. Very, very disconnected indeed from any mainland that you could possibly imagine. And what went on there, what goes on in places like that, will march to its own beat.
Richard, I'm just gonna interrupt you. There's a fabulous comment. It says, the Maypole dancers all auditioned in the gym hall at Douglas Ewart High School. It was a big thing when the film crew visited, but as we had no idea what the film was about at that point. That's brilliant.
Has that Saturday night prime time, problem like Maria written all over it. I see 12 weeks of Richard Coles and others judging Maypole dancers till we have the finest Maypole team that the UK has ever seen.
The dance they did, just so weird, jagged movements and strange sort of robot-like. It's just very odd, very, very
It's also
odd
the Dunican-esque look of the singer.
Yeah.
It's a very so it feels as if suddenly he's walked in from just before Summertime Seaside Special. Mm. I think those, again, I suppose what that ultimately, even when I was younger, I probably actually found those bits rather annoying. Then you realise that's part of what feeds the uncanniness of it all.
Yeah.
By the way, I just thought I'd share, because I went through various different things. I have a library of absolute tats, as you know, and here's my copies of Man, Myth and Magic, amongst other things. But from my friend Jeff Towns, the wonderful bookseller Jeff Towns, I'd forgotten I have this because I thought was solstice related. This is an old 2 and 6pence magazine, X for Men. I don't know if you can see that, but this includes the first ever sexy photo shoot at Stonehenge.
Oh, so my goodness. I never knew that prehistory could be quite so alluring.
It's such a, there we are. That's the sexy nature of Stonehenge in X for Men. I have so much tat in my collection.
It's interesting I'm glad you kind of bring it up in a way, because I don't know if you know Whitehorn or that Galloway well, Robin. I do know it well, and would go there for most years. One of my favourite things there is the way you stumble across prehistoric sites. I'm thinking of Drumtrodden, the stones there, and the cup and ring decorations there, and this sense that they're, and I think it's Neolithic, it's certainly 2,000 to 3,000 years BCE, so we're talking a very long time ago indeed, but they're extraordinarily powerful places, and there is a magic to Whitehorn in particular, and the Rins of Galloway, I think, where you do get the sense that there is something. You can quite imagine how if time were a membrane, that it could be stretched very, very thin in those places. And I think that's something of the strangeness and the beauty of that part of the world imparts itself to the film. I really do. There's something, St Ninian's Cave, very familiar spot, and then up on the cliffs near where it's now a caravan park, isn't it? Where the Wicker Man actually stood. There's a magic about it. Something to do with the quality of light, perhaps, I don't know. But that's in the film too. Do you get it?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, going a bit further north, but that bit of, again, returning to the intangible and that sensation of where the last proper trip I had before lockdown was I was up in Stornoway doing a gig in Stornoway. And I went off, I was fortunately taken for a little drive, and I went to the Stone Circle, which is only about half an hour away from Stornoway. And it's older than Stonehenge. And you're right, and I was very lucky. It was the only sunny day they had in the whole of February. And it was so beautiful. And that moment of touching the rock, that moment of placing your hand on it, that moment that you keep stepping back and you keep seeing different patterns and shapes, and that connection that you feel with whoever it was, whatever group of humans. That is something, again, going back to that science thing, it is that bit which is what we cannot place in an equation, is the strange human sensation. It doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that it then opens us up to dragons and ghosts, whatever it might be, but it nevertheless is a beautiful, intangible moment of connection.
The other thing about it I find quite powerful is that I sense that these marks are not random. Well, they're not random, but we don't know the code. We don't know what they're trying to tell us, if indeed they're trying to tell us something we would recognise at all. And I think that's something which is very powerful in this film too. You have the policeman who's looking at a situation and a thing he thinks is familiar, not getting it, all of a sudden beginning to see patterns in their behaviour which don't make sense, but he doesn't understand what it means. And that's another source, I think, of the tension, which is just such a powerful feature in the film.
Probably turn it into one of the kind of discussions we've had before, Richard, but it always interests me, that bit of not understanding. In the book that I'm working on at the moment, I've spoken to quite a few religious people and our friend Victor Stock, amongst others. And I do find that, again, that I don't know if this is too far off tangent, but I have to understand that I will never be able to truly understand the sensation you feel when you have an experience of God, if you see what I mean. And that point, I think, in what how he fails to do is to be able to understand what is something which he may never be able to sense or feel. That point, I think it's a for both of us, we've had lots of conversations about godlessness and God and what it might mean and what that sensation is. But that to me is part of the thing which highlights civilization. Good civilization is when you are able in some way to say, I cannot experience this, but I will try and find some way of understanding, even if I cannot sense it. And the moment that you have just a dogma, then that's when once that becomes intractable, that's where the bad stuff happens. That's where the forthright, the certainty occurs.
Let me jump in. I think it's not an easy thing to depict faith in a cinematic way because it's interior. Like yourself, because I have no faith, intellectually I can understand that faith exists, but emotionally I can't fathom it. And I wonder, do you guys think that any film, I don't think The Wicker Man particularly conveys the idea of faith to me personally. Do you think any film has ever truly succeeded at that? I know we're going a little off tangent, but the hell with that.
Oh, I know one which I think I would say is one of my favourite films of all time, which is Ingmar Bergman's Winter Light. And it's not due to the fact that it defines faith. It defines faith by showing what happens when someone loses faith. And it's weirdly enough, it's that emptiness. It's a quite, I'm sure you've seen it many times, Richard. It's a remarkable film. It's part of what Bergman hated it being called the Faith Trilogy. But it is that sense of the priest who cannot help. The priest, when Max von Sydow comes to him and says, I'm very worried about the world and I don't want what to do because nuclear Armageddon, what am I going to do? And the priest can give him nothing. And in that moment where he fails to give him anything, in some ways you start to get a definition of what faith is.
I disagree, actually. I think there's something very rich on the subject of faith in The Wicker Man, but you're right, it's not that you don't get a sense, you don't get anything to measure the individual experience of it. What you do get, though, is the corporate experience of it. The Summer Islanders are absolutely solid in their belief, and they will surrender one of their own, a child, as a sacrifice. Actually, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's not seen it, but it's a bit more complicated than that. But in order to propitiate the gods of the sea and the gods of the apple orchards, that they might, so their crops don't fail. So in one sense, this idea that you might. This is very contrary, I think, to our own sort of culture of modernity or post-modernity, where it is so much that human realization occurs for individuals. I think that's probably one of the most fundamental tenets of it. That's not the case for people who are religious, I think, where there is a sense that your destiny in this life and in a life beyond is somehow bound up corporately with others who subscribe to the same thing that you believe. So I think that's actually quite a powerful thing, but maybe incomprehensible too. And another reason why it kind of contributes to this. It is sinister, isn't it? That the kind of blithe way in which the Summer Islanders do acknowledge that human sacrifice might be part of their agronomy.
I do like these moments where I suddenly think, I wonder how many people tuned in hoping we were mainly going to talk about the sexy dancing.
The sexy dancing was a stripper from London. Everyone knows that.
Yeah, but it's interesting because someone I noticed, I think it was Stephen, put up in the comments. Sorry, I can't see the comments very well, but mentioned The Exorcist as an example. Though I think I'm not sure that I get that as much from The Exorcist as maybe Exorcist 3. Which is William Peter Blatty was an incredible. Have you seen Exorcist 3? Either of you?
Is it the one with the locusts?
No, that's Exorcist 2, which is a disaster. That's like Uri Geller was given the rights to the franchise, and it's one of those ones where Richard Burton is just angry throughout. And but Exorcist 3, about 1990, which is connected to the previous film. The first film, and William Peter Blatty, who was a Christian, and his balance between the strangeness of the possibility of evil, the things that cannot be understood, and also the jokes in it. It's an incredible film. I would say out of the Exorcist films, I probably get more of an understanding of ideas of faith and what cannot be understood than The Exorcist.
I must check it out. It just occurred to me something. It goes back to what we were talking about, this thing about the unintelligibility of what makes perfect sense. I mean, the only time I've ever had to been called out for an exorcism that was harder to explain away than people who'd taken too much speed and had then watched a horror film the week before was I was called to a flat. It was a young guy's flat. Which his parents were terrified of and thought it was possessed by demons. Anyway, I went round there and it was just a young 17-year-old's flat, sort of fag ash and pizza boxes and stuff. And then I went into the kitchen. The kitchen was completely pristine and brightly lit, and everything had been taken out of the cupboards and arranged in patterns on the floor and on the surfaces. And it was so incongruous. I got a chill down my back. It was absolutely a moment of absolute horror at seeing this, because it was unintelligible signs, patterns that meant nothing, but were kind of full of a meaning that I couldn't understand.
Oh, have you ever read the book Bee Season by Mila Goldberg?
No, I haven't.
It's turned into a slightly unsatisfying film, but it's a fascinating, because that is a film about a very kind of high functioning Jewish family, and the one person, the daughter's the one who's not that great. The dad's the mother is the son's really, and then it just turns out she seems to have an innate ability to do the spelling bee. This big thing about, and it is all about, in each one of the characters, it is about their search for faith, their search for one truth, their search for patterns.
Yeah,
and I think that's an interesting, that bit there where you talk about that idea where a pattern that cannot be understood, our pattern-seeking brain, sometimes when it goes into a place where maybe it shouldn't, where it goes into a place where it's not functioning in what we might consider to be some correct way, then the patterns that can be created are totally beyond our comprehension.
This has come up in the comments, so I'm going to change tack. And
Is it talk about the bloody film? Fair enough.
This is about the film. This is about the fact that this film, uniquely, I don't know, I've not seen loads of horror films, but in most horror films, the first people to die are the people who are sexually active, especially if they're young. In this film, being sexually active protects you. And not only that, but all the women are totally at one with their sexual urges and their erotic natures, and it's really it's unusual, don't you think, for the genre?
I think it's quite a late on, but I would say the real rise of the murder due to having sex is kind of, in particular, a late 70s thing. So I would say that when you saw Men, Women and Chainsaws by Carol Glover is a very interesting book about the kind of relationship of women in horror films. And I think once you get to the Friday the 13th movies and the Halloween movies and stuff, I would say what you have with sex before that is a tremendous fear. But it's not the same thing. But it is. There's a terror of, like Ingrid Pitt, of course, whether she's Countess Dracula or whether she's in. I'm trying to think whether it's Vampire Lovers is the one with her, the Karnstein trilogy. That then it is still wrong because the woman is powerful, And so, the Karnstein trilogy, Twins of Evil, and all that. But the punishment, I think, I think it becomes something which is a late 70s thing. So, I mean, I do think the thing about Wicker Man is it is still a tremendously unusual movie. It's like, it doesn't feel as unusual now, but if you look at what Hammer were bringing out, if you look at what Amicus were bringing out, it's nothing like the Wicker Man. You could say closer to perhaps Witchfinder General or Blood on Satan's Claw. That's kind of more of that stuff. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. You're right; they are entirely. But then again, maybe they're liberated, but they're not punished. But are they still seen, at least by Howie, in the same evil way that he might see the Karnstein women, for instance?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think one of the things in the film that works so well, again, is you see what looks like a kind of West Highland community full of sort of people who look entirely respectable, talking about phallic symbols to a room full of schoolgirls. It's so uncanny, that, isn't it? So cleverly observed that we have these assumptions about what people who live in communities like the West Highlands or the Hebrides would be like, and all of a sudden that's kind of massively subverted.
Well, one of our listeners asked. Hang on, I need to scroll back. One of our listeners says, basically saying, "Do you not think that the Wicker Man is depicting English attitudes towards what they think goes on in Scotland?" Which is sort of a version of what you just said. And apologies for messing that question up because I just couldn't find it in the scroll back.
Well, I mean, I think the English are notorious, aren't they, for not getting Scotland? And interesting, that's a very interesting one. I think most English people I know think they get Scotland because its versions of it are familiar to us and the language we understand. But I can remember when I first started spending time in Scotland, for the first 10 years I was still discovering ways in which it was completely different from what I thought it was. Scottish politics I've still failed utterly to understand. But Scottish culture, and also actually the way Scottish people relate to each other is different from the sort of patterns that, I don't know, painting in very broad brushstrokes here, but certainly from the sort of patterns that I was used to. And my mother grew up in Scotland, and we've always had a very sort of close and romantic feeling for it. But it is a different country and a different culture. And I think for English people, that moment of realization that you've not really got it, which so many Scottish cultural forms have played, particularly in film and novels, I think, that's very interesting. I hadn't really thought of it too, but it is a very weird, distorted mirror of English attitudes to Scotland, perhaps.
And it ties back into the idea of colonialism, which we've been tossing around as well.
Yeah.
See, I'd agree with Richard, what he's just said, but I would disagree that that's what the film is about. I think if it was intended, then you would have had, especially because it's Edward Woodward, who was, you would have had him playing an English policeman. I think they would have underlined it at least that much. So I think it is still about the difference between that very organised, and I think, as you said, going back to the flinty Calvinism. But I think it's very interesting ideas, but I personally don't get that feeling from the film that that's what it's about.
Fair enough. And just what about the legacy of the Wicker Man? I mean, as we've even touched upon this, the League of Gentlemen, certainly it was an influence on them. I mean, there's a few moments in the candy shop where I was like, local things for local people.
Well, you actually have Sergeant Howie goes in there. You have Mark Gatiss in one of the first episodes goes to the local shop looking for, and I think he actually, I don't think they say Rowan Morrison, but it's close enough.
Oh, really? Let the reader understand.
Yeah.
But how else, again, you guys know much more about this than I do. How else has it created a legacy? Where else can we see echoes of the Wicker Man in culture today?
Well, folk horror's huge. I mean, it's a really interesting, certainly in my niche world, I would say in the last 10 years, you see that things like the Fortean Times have really, in the 90s, they very much focused on the X-Files. In this decade, more and more folk horror. The Fortean Times has always been interesting. There's various different things, whether it's Green Man, Wicker Man, all of those different kind of manifestations of nature when it meets kind of civilized humanity. But and I think, as I mentioned before, films like Midsummer and Hereditary, and there's Apostle, I think, which is a very interesting Michael Sheen film, a Welsh film. I think at the moment we're going through a very interesting time where The Wicker Man is this real touchstone for people who've become tremendously confused by what goes on in our civilization and our politics, but may well not have a god, a traditional god. And yet somewhere, when you look at, there's a lovely magazine called Weird Walk as well. And again, it's run by a lot of these people who do these things are not religious people, but they're just kind of like, it's nice to work some kind of connection, to think of the different ways that we connect. And I see that more and more as well, I think, in some of the scientific events that I do with some of the people as well. So I think it is, it's been a very useful connection for a lot of people with a myriad number of ideas about different ways of working out how you deal with being human.
I think it also stands in a very interesting tradition, which is of the kind of Gothic horror, English Gothic horror. The Pan horror stories that came out in multiple volumes in the 1970s. Tales of the Unexpected, Anglia TV series based on the Roald Dahl stories, which again are beautifully written, very, very taut and tight, well-constructed short stories that have this, usually this kind of, exactly, Herbert Van Tal, the kind of switch in the turn that makes you realise that the world that you thought you knew, you don't know anymore. Interesting, I have the faint echo of it. I don't know if you're watching the reruns of Alan Bennett's Talking Heads at the moment. There's just a faint echo of it there. It's half an hour, it's short form, it's very simple and direct. But all of a sudden you're looking at people who you think you know, and suddenly they say something or a story is revealed that realise that you don't know them at all.
Mm.
Well, I think that's one of the hardest things of being human, is working out the fact that we are Philippa Perry, the wonderful therapist Philippa Perry. One of my first conversations with her, she said the problem with being human is we judge everyone else from their exterior and ourselves from the interior, and very often we're so ashamed of what our interior is that what we project and what everyone believes we are and what we believe are and I think that's what horror is dealing with, sometimes in the ways which would be Robert Louis Stevenson, Jekyll and Hyde, but so much of it I think is dealing with. I wanted to quickly mention, just because I know we're probably near the end, but we haven't talked about her at all, and I really want to recommend, it's not in print anymore, but you will find it secondhand. Ingrid Pitt, who is wonderful. If you ever watch interview when she talked about The Wicker Man, while Edward Woodward and Christopher Lee and everyone else is saying how brilliant it is, she kind of goes, it's all right. And she's very, but I just wanted to mention her because she is someone who should be celebrated a lot more than she is. She lived an incredible life. She survived the concentration camps in the Second World War with her mother. And in this book, that's a lot of what it's about. And then when she went to Hollywood after Where Eagles Dare, one of the reasons she didn't become a huge star was she was not having any of that casting couch stuff. And there's a lovely story. I can't remember which person it was on set talks about this in Wicker Man. They talk about how when they were filming that incredible final scene, and it's freezing, everyone's freezing, and they're all wearing, he said, you saw the way, if you wanted to judge different people, you saw the way they acted when cut was called. And they said when cut was called, one of the guys would bring all of the coats to, it was Britt Eklund, and it was Diane Cilento, and it was Ingrid Pitt. And Britt Eklund would just grab her coat and put it on like that. And Diane Cilento would say, thank you so much, that's very kind of you. And Ingrid Pitt would say, if there's not time for the extras to get their coats on, there's not time for me to get my coat on. And I think that, again, is just, I never got to meet her, but a few of my friends did. And I wanted to mention her because even though it's quite a small part in the film in some ways, she has a lot more of a story than you might imagine if you just think of her as kind of Countess Dracula. And again, as I said, just that joy of her going, it's all right,
Any concluding remarks, my dear friends? Let me just say that I screwed up. The watch along is happening on Twitter, not on Zoom. So move on to a different social network, and then back over to the two of you.
I think it's a great movie. I've never tired of watching it. It's one of those things, it's one of those movies that I would very happily watch every year on an appointed day, perhaps midsummer, although it's May, really, isn't it, in the film? Perhaps May Day I will watch The Wicker Man and consider thoughtfully the various interesting tensions and continuities between Orthodox Christianity and pagan blood sacrifice.
And that is a very important thing to do in the Wellingborough area, I always
Very
think.
big. We had a coven here. We had the hall, which was derelict for years, has now been restored. But there was a coven that met in Findon Hall in the 1970s and received lavish coverage in the Kettering Evening Telegraph. But everything seems to be returned to normal service now.
My end remark was going to be that I was one of the things that I love about Christopher Lee. In the last, I was meant to be doing a tour in October called The Satanic Rites of Robin Ince, and I had a lot of stuff about Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in it. And Peter Cushing is obviously he's not in the film. There were rumours he was meant to be Sergeant Howie, but I can't see that. I don't think that was ever. But there's a beautiful bit where Christopher Lee, of course, very often, as you know, he sings in this film, and he would often say, "Well, of course, in Germany, I'm known best as an opera singer." Blah. And there's one thing that always makes me very happy is there's a film called Return of Captain Invincible with Alan Arkin. So you're sold on that already. Alan Arkin, by the way, who has a co-write credit on the Banana Boat song. There's a bit of information you didn't require, but I've given it to you now. And Christopher Lee sings this wonderful song which just goes, "Might I say that? I'm old-fashioned, très van ordinaire. I'd like to thresh Manhattan with white Anglo-Saxon everywhere. A black Russian's no pink lady, give her the Singapore sling. If Moscow Mule is not your baby, then highball your eyeball and name your sting. Be a big shot with bullshot, be a swine, be salavine. Have a porter, a snorter, a quart of any sort. Aste spumante, uno chiante, ate fa." Anyway, that's one of the wonderful things he does, and I thought I'd just do that. I've never done that sitting down before.
He sings
very
a
different
drinks
process.
menu. Excellent. He sings a drinks menu. I'm going to try that the next time I'm
It's
out.
really it's on YouTube. You can just see him, and the song's written by Richard Hartley and Richard O'Brien. So of course it is filled with joyous puns and various different oddities in it as well.
Well, it's up to me now to thank you, Robin, and you, Richard, for being your wonderful selves. To thank everybody who came. To thank people like Bailey Gifford, who helped sponsor the festival, to everyone who's hit that donate button, to everyone who's buying Robin and Richard's books. This is customary when I ask for a round of applause, so I'll do it as a ceremonial round of applause. And thank you again. We'll see everyone over on Twitter. Bye.